So I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement, and this land acknowledgement was provided by the Museum of Dufferin, so I just want to thank them for putting this together. So just like to acknowledge that Dufferin County resides within the traditional territory and ancestral lands of the Tionatati, the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples. We also acknowledge that various municipalities within the County of Dufferin reside within the treaty lands named under the Haldeman Deed of 1784 and two of the Williams Treaties of 1818. Treaty 18, the Nottawasaga Purchase, and Treaty 19, the Agentins Treaty. I hope I said that one right. These traditional territories upon which we live and learn are steeped in rich Indigenous history and traditions, and it is with this statement that we declare to honor and respect the past and present connection of Indigenous peoples with this land, its waterways, and its resources. So I'm very pleased to have Julie McNevin present this evening as we acknowledge Treaty Recognition Week. Julie is the education programmer with the Museum of Dufferin, and she is an educator in every sense of the word. Not only is she a brilliant teacher, but she is a lifelong student, always learning and in some cases unlearning. Julie grew up in the ancestral heartland of the Wendat Peoples near Midland, Ontario, and on Treaty 16 land. She is a descendant of some of the first settlers to benefit from the colonization of what is now called Simcoe County. Julie is on a journey to reflect and understand and act on her roles and responsibilities as a settler person and a museum professional to support reconciliation. Through her studies and her work as a historical interpreter at Sainte-Marie among the Hurons, Julie developed a passion for research and exploring the links between past events and the present. We are so honored to have Julie share her knowledge with our community this evening. She will discuss ancestral and treaty lands in Dufferin County, as well as an overview of the journey to create the museum's resource guide, the lessons learned along the way, and their ongoing commitment to decolonization and resource recommendations. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Julie.
Thank you so much, Shannon. So I'll just share my presentation screen here. So hoping everyone can hear me okay. Thank you so much for joining in tonight and spending this time. I think it's a bit of a learning journey for all of us as we go through this. And I hope that you get quite a bit out of it. So this evening, as Shannon mentioned, I'll be going over treaty lands relevant or related to what we now call Dufferin County. And you'll certainly find more in-depth discussion of some of these points in our resource, Indigenous History and Treaty Lands in Dufferin County. It's available on our Learning Hub at dufferinmuseum.com. And the Orangeville Library has generously offered to print out copies if you would prefer to have a print copy on hand to read. Throughout this presentation, I've built in a few multiple choice questions. These are just not quiz questions, I call them knowledge building questions, just an opportunity to have a little fun and to interact with you. And we're all coming at this from different places in our learning, different points in our learning journey. So this will give us a chance to unpack some of the history behind some of these questions. As we go through those questions, you are certainly welcome, if you feel comfortable, to drop your answer into the chat, but don't feel that you have to. I've built in quite a few suggested reads with a focus on Indigenous created or Indigenous led resources. I have included the links. However, you might find it easier to do a Google search, and Shannon is also going to compile a list of these resources, so you'll be able to receive them in your email as well. So don't feel like you have to take screenshots or try to write everything down and save the links. One of the reasons that I'm doing this is that as a settler person, I don't have the right to speak for or to speak to the experiences of Indigenous people. And so I feel that by accessing or sharing some of these resources with you, whether it's a book or a blog or a video, this is one step that you can take to listen and learn from Indigenous perspectives and voices. It's really important that I not be doing that. So we'll get started. So land treaties is a pretty complex topic, and there is certainly a lot to unpack. And I think in the span of the time we have, we won't be able to do all of that. And so that's where a lot of these resources are going to be very important as well. You can get to the places where you feel that your learning is best suited. So I guess it is a good place to start is to say that there really isn't a single formula or position that can be applied in the pursuit of understanding treaties and treaty relationships. There's multiple angles to consider, including in an examination of our own backgrounds and our own biases. So for me, and I suspect many other settler folks, we were raised on a colonial nation building narrative, which largely ignored Indigenous perspectives and experiences and portrayed Indigenous peoples as voiceless victims in a lot of cases. When I started exploring treaty lands and to try to research and build out the resource, and was reaching out to First Nations communities or educators, and sitting in on webinars or taking courses, I soon discovered that I had a lot to unlearn and learn. And I think that's a really good starting point if you're just beginning your journey. I'd like to take a moment to invite you to think about why or how you're coming to this in terms of your understanding of colonization or decolonization, in terms of maybe just more specifically land treaties. Maybe you want to think about what Indigenous lands you live on or work on, and which you may want to acknowledge. What is your position? What biases might you have? What might you just want to know or want to know? And so taking a moment to reflect on those and to be asking ourselves some of those questions about where you are and in your learning journey is a good place to start. So we'll get started with just a brief overview on what are land treaties and sort of why were they made. And again, lots to unpack there, but I'll attempt a brief overview anyway. So a basic definition of a land treaty would be an agreement between two parties to establish rights and obligations over a territory or area of land. Many of the land treaties made between First Nations and representatives of the Crown involve the cessation or giving up of any interest in ancestral lands in return for specific payments or promises. And we'll go through some examples shortly, and that will help to unpack that. But if you think of the word interest, giving up interest, there could be many interpretations of really what that might mean. When you think of payment and promises, there's questions that arise of were they fulfilled and how and to what degree. And so living up to the obligations of these treaties and asking questions about that becomes very important in terms of treaty issues. And that's historically and right up to the present times. One of the core reasons why Europeans or colonials pursued these treaties was to acquire lands for settlement and resources. If you can think back or remember staying awake during lessons on the colonization of North America, you may recall that primarily it was France and England competing for control over what we now call Canada. And that was largely fueled by a desire for resource control. For Indigenous peoples, there's long-standing traditions of treaty making prior to colonization. However, rapid changes occurred as a result of colonization, which saw influxes of settlers, deterioration of lack of access to resources, reliance on trade goods in some cases, and the possible threat of war. So that is to say that this would have led, if not coerced, Indigenous leaders into treaty negotiations in the hopes of achieving shared land use or to try and preserve autonomy over their people and sovereignty. And in cases it becomes an issue of survival, what will be able to be passed on to the next generations. An important historical event that would come to define how and why treaties were made was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and you can see a version of that on the slide here. So during the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1760, this resulted in bitter fight over colonial assets, including North America, and it resulted in the Treaty of Paris in 1763, in which France gave up most of its assets within North America, so ceded it to the British. The British Crown immediately after issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And it was to lay out the rules for treaty making across what we now would call Canada. And the essential idea of it was that any land held by Indigenous people was to remain theirs until ceded by treaty to the Crown. And after which time the Crown could then issue that by grant or by sale that land to settlers. The proclamation, however, was written without input or really any regard, you could say, for Indigenous people, and was intended to impose colonial control, ownership and governance over the lands that were now deemed to belong to the king, which was George III at the time. So this obviously would end up coming at great expense to Indigenous populations. Just for the sake of time, but also to give you some great places to go to explore this further, particularly if you're thinking about exploring the differences in worldview or some of the more nuanced aspects of treaty relationships. I would recommend checking out the Indigenous Corporate Training Incorporated blog in particular. And there's a few titles here that they've put together recently: First Nation Relationships to Land, Indigenous Peoples Worldview versus Western Worldview. And there's also a number of downloadable resources. So Dispelling Common Myths, for example, featured on the bottom of the slide, has some information about myths surrounding present day reserve lands and access to resources. And so you might find that really helpful and insightful. I know that I have. So we'll start with getting into talking about some of the ancestral lands and treaty lands that are relevant to present day Dufferin County. And we'll start with the Teontotati or Wyandot, and we'll start with a question. So it is, what is the name Teontotati thought to mean? Is it A, Tobacco Nation, B, People of the Hills, C, Dwellers of the Peninsula, or D, People of the Longhouse? And if you would like to put your answer in the chat, you're welcome to do that. Hopefully I'll see it, but I'll give you a few seconds just to think that over and decide. So if you said People of the Hills, you would be correct. And it's actually a bit of a trick question. And the reason for that is that there are at least 65 possible names, if not more, various spellings of Teontotati. You might be more familiar with the name Petun, and it's generally accepted that it's okay to say Petun. However, that isn't a self-assigned name. And so recent scholarship or in recent times, there is preference being given to saying Wendat or Wyandot, which is a present day identifier. And I'll explain how that comes to be. So the Teontotati or Wyandot people, well, and I'll use Teontotati for the sake of, we're talking about historic settlements here. So their main hub of settlement was essentially present day Collingwood, Blue Mountain, Clearview Township, Craigleith area in particular. And so that was the main hub for, say, villages and settlement. However, the ancestral lands extended well over what is present day Dufferin County. And the reason for that is that riverways such as the Nottawasaga River and its tributaries provided access for purposes of hunting, fishing, gathering, travel for trade, very extensive trade networks prior to the arrival of any Europeans. And this supported or complemented their agriculture and farming lifestyle. The Teontotati are believed to have used these riverways, as I said, for the purposes of travel and trade, so reaching well into other regions to have contact with groups such as the Neutral, the Wendat that lived around present-day Midland area where I grew up. In the mid-1600s, war between the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee resulted in the fall of Wendake. And as neighboring allies and closely associated with the Wendat people, the Teontotati were driven from their homelands. There may likely never be complete certainty over the events and over the numbers of refugees who fled the area. However, it's commonly accepted that the majority of the Teontotati who dispersed from the area ended up settling and merging with the Wendat people, primarily in Kansas and Quebec, and some may have been assimilated into Haudenosaunee culture as well. A couple of resources I'd recommend checking out. Daughters of Atienzik and Dispersed But Not Destroyed are two books by the same author, Catherine McGee-LaBelle. She is a professor at the University of Saskatchewan. She is a settler historian who is a member of, an honorary member, I should say, of the Wyandot Nation of Kansas. Her Dispersed But Not Destroyed book, the title just about says it all, that the Wendat people, we tend to talk about them in terms of after the fall of Wendake, they disappeared. Well, there is survivance of that culture and history and language, which is truly amazing. And she explores that in her book. And Daughters of Atienzik is a brand new book. Catherine worked on this book with the Women's Advisory Council from the Wendat Nation, so well worth a look. You may also want to check out resources from the Wyandot Nation itself. If you look under culture and history, there's some great articles there. And then under culture and language, you can explore some of the language recovery work that's been going on, and you can listen to audio files, pardon me, of the Wendat language being spoken. So we'll move on to the Haudenosaunee, and you might be familiar with the term Iroquois or Iroquoian, which for a very long time have often been the word or name associated with the Six Nations Confederacy, its people and its culture. But similar to Petun or even Huron versus Wendat, it's not a self-assigned or often preferred name. So Haudenosaunee or Six Nations would be better. I've included the name and the link in the bottom here, a video by Perry Ground and on YouTube, and he does a really great job of explaining the origins of Iroquois and Haudenosaunee and what they mean. But I'll take a second to ask, Haudenosaunee means, is it A, people of the Longhouse, B, keepers of the central fire, C, people of the Great Lakes, or D, Confederacy of Nations? I'll give you a second to think about that. And if you guessed or said, maybe no, A, it's people of the Longhouse. And if you watch Perry Ground's video, he actually extends that out. He says people who build the Longhouse. And that's in reference to the unity established between the Six Nations and the social and political organization of Haudenosaunee society. The Hiawatha Wampum Belt, which you can see on the screen, recorded and tells the story of 5 warring nations that came to peace, perhaps sometime between 1475 and 1525. The Tuscarora joined as the Six Nation in 1722, and this union is represented on the Six Nations flag right to this day. During the 1600s, the Haudenosaunee territory expanded into present-day Quebec and Ontario, and this resulted from increased settlement in the American colonies, competition over resources, and warfare. By the late 1600s, early 1700s, the Haudenosaunee moved back more or less to the traditional lands along the south side of the Great Lakes. But some Haudenosaunee peoples would come to reside in Ontario once again, and that part of that reason is due to the Haldeman Proclamation. And that is named after Sir Frederick Haldeman, who is a British war veteran and at the time the governor of Quebec. In more recent times, this tract or grant is spoken of as a treaty. Basically how it came about was that in compensation for the alliance or assistance to the British during the American Revolutionary War, the British Crown signed a decree in 1784 granting the Haudenosaunee people 6 miles, which equates to roughly 10 kilometers, on either side of the Grand River from its mouth to its source. And the land was granted, that had been granted, was believed to have been acquired under treaty from the Mississauga and Ojibwe and Anishinaabe peoples. And that's sort of why, because the land was under treaty in the first place, why it's typically referred to as a tract or a grant. Several issues soon arose from this, and one being that as a land grant, the Haudenosaunee believed that they would control the title and the right to sell that land. However, the Crown wanted to maintain that control. Next, and perhaps most significant to Dufferin County, is that when Upper Canada was created in 1791 after the fall of New France, the Haldeman Proclamation was put under review. And it was determined that the source, which is the section that appears in the picture on the screen, or the headwaters portion, was not part of the territory that had been acquired from the Mississauga in 1784. So the tract was resurveyed, and this resulted in the Simcoe patent, which sought to exclude the headwaters section. And the Haudenosaunee did not, and to my knowledge, still do not accept the Simcoe patent. Some resources that you might want to check out. A couple books that I'd recommend. Susan Hill is a professor at the University of Toronto and director of the Centre for Indigenous Studies. Her book, The Clay We Are Made Of, was published in 2017. She is from the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation and a resident of Ohsweken Grand River Territory. Rick Montour is the author of We Share Our Matters. He's a member of the Turtle Clan and the Mohawk Nation from 6 Nations of the Grand River Territory, and he's a professor at McMaster University. I would also recommend checking out these resources from 6 Nations of the Grand River. Some of our team had the opportunity to sit down with representatives of 6 Nations of the Grand River Territory, and some of these were the resources that were provided to us and recommended, and provide a really good overview of the Haldeman Proclamation. And then finally, there was a moratorium called on the development of the Haldeman Tract in the spring by the 6 Nations. And so there's a website now, Protect the Tract, and that provides some good insight into the perspective on that. So Anishinaabe and Ojibwe are sometimes used interchangeably or as synonyms. There are other First Nations who identify as Anishinaabe, Odawa, Potawatomi, Algonquin, Nipissing, Mississauga, just to name a few. So it's really a broad term that describes many culturally or linguistically related people or groups or nations. And within that, there's a lot of distinct identities. So that's something to keep in mind. There are several possible meanings and interpretations of the name Anishinaabe, and you can certainly find those by scouring the internet. However, it is commonly thought to mean one of these 4 things, so I'll pose it as a question again. Anishinaabe, pardon me, is often thought to mean A, traders, B, where the rivers meet, C, Three Fires Council, or D, original person. Maybe a second to think about that. And if you said D, you would be correct. Original person or original people, if you were saying Anishinaabe, plural. And that's really in reference to a lot of the origin stories of the Anishinaabe First Nations people. So before we go on into the treaty lands that come out of Anishinaabe relationships with colonizers, just share a couple of resources here that you could look into. First of all, a book that was recommended to me by the librarian at Mississauga of the Credit First Nations is Peter Schmaltz's book. Peter Schmaltz wrote this book after retiring from teaching, He was hired to do a lot of reports for the Ministry of Natural Resources, for First Nations communities, and the federal and provincial governments. His book was published originally in 1991, but it has been reprinted several times, most recently in 2014. I'd also recommend checking out some of the resources from the Anishinaabe Nation. They've put out a lot of really great educational resources. I put top banner. It's a little bit tucked away off of the main menu. There's a top menu to that website to check out. A couple of videos that really resonated with me that I wanted to share that were posted by the Anishinaabe Nation on YouTube, Charlie Angus on treaties and Hayden King on treaties. Would highly recommend checking those out. And then finally, the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation has some resources available through their Environment Office, specifically on land acknowledgements and how to do that respectfully. So for Dufferin County, you should definitely know about Treaty 18, which is also called the Lake Simcoe Nottawasaga Treaty, or Purchase. It was created on October 17th, 1818, and led by William Kloss as the Crown's representative, who held the position of Superintendent of Indian Affairs at the time. He was responsible for a number of treaties that are referred to as the Williams Treaties. 4 Ojibwe chiefs were the signatories to the treaty. It outlines the surrender of 1,592,000 acres of land in exchange for a sum of 1,200 pounds in goods at the Montreal price paid annually. So essentially material goods being paid in exchange for this land. This includes lands within the present-day Mono Township, Mulmer Township, Melanchthon Township, Town of Shelburne, Amaranth, and the town of Grand Valley. Before we move on, I have another quick question for you as well. So, and this relates to the fact that it's called the Lake Simcoe Nottawasaga Treaty. So the word Nottawasaga might come from the Algonquin words Nadoe or Nadoa, meaning A, Haudenosaunee at the mouth of the river, B, Wendat on the riverbanks, C, people of the inlet or bay, or D, the way to the bay. Give you a second to think about that. And if you said A, you would be correct. Now, I find it a little bit tough to confirm this, and I think maybe it's a bit of folklore at this point, but it said that this was a term used when Haudenosaunee canoes or war parties were spotted at the mouth of the Nottawasaga River, what became called the Nottawasaga River. So Treaty 18 resources, there really isn't a lot out there on Treaty 18. However, there are a couple places you can go. The Williams Treaties site has some information on it. You can get the full transcript of the treaty rather than trying to read it off of something like a scan of the original, which can be quite difficult. However, I do find that going to a place like the Library and Archives Canada website, where they have the scans of the original treaty documents, is really good insight. Just seeing that document and how it was written and seeing the signatures on it is quite impactful and offers good insight. So we'll move on to Treaty 19. So it is Adjutants of the Mississauga of the Credit. The treaty was also signed by 4 other leaders of the Mississauga on October 28, 1818. Chief Adjutants at this time was an elderly man who was seeing his population and people's way of life diminishing rapidly, and as a result of increased settlement, warfare, disease, and famine. Treaty 19 was made in order to try and preserve what little they had left and try to ensure the survival of his people. The terms included the cessation of 648,000 acres of land in exchange for 522 pounds and 10 shillings, province currency and goods at the Montreal price paid annually. Areas of present-day Dufferin County that fall within this treaty include East Garifraxa and the town of Orangeville. And so one last question here. In the mid-1700s, the Mississauga became closely associated with this river as a result of the fur trade. I've probably given that one away. So it is D, the Credit River. That was the major meeting point was at the mouth of the Credit. Treaty 19 resources. The Mississauga of the Credit have put out a wealth of resources on Treaty 19, including maps, which I ended up doing a historical overlay for, an overlay of Dufferin County for that. And then there's I would recommend checking out on their website the culture and history and the historical tidbits. There's some really great pieces of information there, and a downloadable PDF where you can check out the history of the Mississauga of the Credit as well. And there is a video on YouTube now, which I just found actually this week. So it's an overview of Treaty 19. So that's it. Thank you very much for coming on this learning journey with me, and I hope that you've gotten something out of this. I would definitely encourage that if you're going to access these resources and use these resources, to be thinking about how you could support them. So if it's something, for example, from Mississauga of the First Nations, maybe is there a way to give to the library and support that work that's going on there and what's being provided. I'm happy to answer some questions if you have any. I'll turn it over to Shannon to facilitate that. But thank you very much for joining in tonight and for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Julie. And I just want to acknowledge, here at the Orangeville Public Library and our own work for working towards truth and reconciliation, what a wealth of information and resources that you and the team at the Museum of Dufferin have available to the community and to all of us in Dufferin County to continue with that learning. And your presentation tonight just goes to show really how much there is to learn and how much there is in history to acknowledge, and all of those truths that we still need to uncover before we can move towards reconciliation. And just thank you, for taking the time. I know you're continuing to learn, and we're all continuing to learn, but for taking the time to teach us everything that you did this evening so that we could continue on our own personal journeys of learning. I was sharing with Julie before we got started tonight that I was reading an article from CBC News about the Royal British Columbia Museum and the work that they're doing towards decolonizing. And one of the ways that they're doing that is to take down some of their exhibits and to just revisit the history that they are presenting and whose lens that history is being presented through and whose perspectives are being represented. And I know when I was speaking with Julie, you also mentioned just your own work and the Museum of Dufferin's work to decolonize. And I wondered if you wanted to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So we will be looking at our resource in terms of reviewing it and thinking about it through a decolonization lens and looking to build relationships and find educators who can help us on that journey and give us that framework. I recently had the honor of sitting in on a webinar that involved truth and reconciliation and museums, and that was led by Algonquin leaders in the Ottawa area. And there's just so much to learn there in terms of museums historically have sometimes contributed harm to Indigenous communities and Indigenous individuals. And right up to present times, there's things not always being done in terms of wise practices or best practices, and that's certainly not what we want to be doing. We want to be putting our wise practices in place and bringing that forward as much as possible to build relationships, to build communication, to build dialogue. And to do that in a way that we're being respectful, but also that includes reciprocity, making sure that when we're seeking out information or we're seeking out resources, we're not just taking up energy and taking up spaces. It's been that way for far too long. And so the Algonquin leaders are really calling for museum professionals to find different ways to connect, new ways to connect, and better ways to connect. And, you know, those historic harms that have happened in the past, like, we have to do better. And there's a commitment there that comes with that. And it's a long-term commitment. It's not something that you ever say, oh, okay, check the box, or we did that. It's an ongoing thing. And so we're really excited for that, because, you know, it brings in the opportunity for, you know, there needs to be space, and there needs to be space for voices and people to be heard, and to move forward as much as we possibly can with reconciliation.
I know here personally at the library, in our journey to work towards a decolonization as well, one of the projects that we're undertaking is our collections team has undergone like diversity training, and one of the elements of that training was to look at, you know, subject headings and naming and the word choices that are used in our collection, so that when people go into our catalog and are searching for text, that the names and those subject headings are respectful and are inclusive. And then also taking it further and looking at our collection and ensuring that the resources and the books that we do have are respectful representations of people, and if they're not, to remove those from the collection, recognizing that they're not inclusive, and that what we have in our books and on our shelves need to contribute to creating that inclusive and welcoming space for everybody. So I know that's just one of the starting projects that we have undertaken. Yeah. And I know personally with myself doing story times for children and young families, recognizing the privilege that I have in choosing what books I share with those children, and being aware of whose voice I'm representing in those story times, which authors am I choosing to share, whose stories am I choosing to share, and just constantly self-reflecting on that. And I know we recently celebrated First Nations Public Library Week and Children Reconciliation Week, but not just sharing Indigenous voices during those times, but throughout the year, and celebrating their culture and their worldviews and incorporating that into what we're doing here.
Absolutely, well said. Yeah, there a couple of things there. You know, a friend of mine uses the expression, and some people may have heard it before, nothing about us without us. And so I think that really is a good framing, that if you are putting the work you're doing, whether it's personally or professionally, through that lens, and through that directive, and, you know, that's a good place to start. And as you're mentioning too, like the work the library is doing, there were specific calls for museums and what in the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. So that's something too that, you know, museums are taking looks at their collections and their records, and what work needs to be done there. And that's kind of a good starting point. And then beyond that, you know, reaching out and building those relationships as much as possible. I think Nancy asked a question here. Curious, is there a source that keeps one up to date on the moratorium? So good question, Nancy. I think that at this point, one of the best places to go would be to the Protect the Tract website. That seems to be where a lot of the information is going to be brought forward. It looks like to me like it was, I hadn't seen it before. It's I think a relatively new website. And then beyond that, checking out the Six Nations of the Grand River website, there's news feeds there, so you can probably catch some updates that way.
And we'll be sure to share all of these links as well. So we'll follow up with everyone who registered. And we also have started a page on our website with Truth and Reconciliation resources that we're going to continuously update as we continue learning and connecting with different community partners and finding out what's going on both in the community and at large. So we'll make sure that we update that as well, and give everyone the link to that too.